Well, good morning, everyone. My name is David Chaundy, and I'm the President and CEO of APEC, also known as the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council. And I'd like to welcome you to this, what is our second webinar on the economic effects of COVID-19. I know there are over 500 people currently joining, and people are joining as I speak, but we do want to stay to time as closely as possible. I would also like to thank our members and patrons for their ongoing support. We are a member-supported nonprofit organization, and we could not sustain the research that we are doing and sharing with you today without the support of our members. Typically, this information will be available only to our members or at a fee for those who are non-members, but this webinar and the material that we have been providing on our website is being made freely available in the public interest as part of our mandate to provide independent research, insight, and ideas to support a healthy, inclusive, and sustainable Atlantic economy. So if you do find this information helpful, I would ask you to consider, when you get back to the office and when your business is back up and running, that you would consider becoming a member and supporting Atlantic Canada's independent voice on economic issues. Again, just to let you know, the slides for today will be on our website. They should be available this afternoon, and the recording of the webinar will also be available by tomorrow morning. So where are we? Well, in times of stress, I go to my fridge. The data suggests that some of you are going to the liquor store, but I go to my fridge. And on my fridge, I have what I'm calling my pandemic tracker. We've been now shut down for 6 weeks here in Nova Scotia, and we're now into week 7. In our first webinar 6 weeks ago, as the economy was starting the great shutdown, and that recording of that webinar is also available on our website, it was titled Assessing the Potential Economic Impacts, because we knew it was going to be bad, we just didn't know how bad at the time. We outlined the range of activities that were being affected. We explained the importance of those activities for trade, output, and movement of workers, and we highlighted the various transmission channels and priorities for policy. So in the last 6 weeks, we've been estimating, tracking, and reporting on the size of these various economic indicators to describe the economic impacts of the Great Shutdown. So this webinar is entitled The Unfolding Economic Impacts, and these impacts are ongoing and will increase with time. So today what we would like to cover is to talk about the overall impact on which industries have been hit the hardest. And the headline or takeaway from this portion is, it's bad. Then we'll talk about the fiscal impact, and the headline or takeaway from that portion is, it's bad. Then we're going to talk about tracking the reported COVID-19 cases. And the headline from here is, don't jump the gun, there are some encouraging signs. And this is key because it impacts the duration of the shutdown and therefore when the recovery can really get started. But don't get too excited too soon, because we're then going to talk about policy and recovery. And the headline here is, be patient. It is going to take a while for the recovery. And our advice to governments is be careful to get this right, because the shutdown has already been hard enough. So I'm going to focus on Atlantic Canada's economy, and I will also emphasize, as I did in the first webinar, that this region in Atlantic Canada cannot fully recover until we see a recovery in our provincial and international trading partners. Because ultimately, until we see goods, services, and people flowing freely across jurisdictional borders, we are not going to see the full economic recovery. So I'm very pleased to talk about the Canadian and international situation. Joining me this morning is Pierre Cléroux. He's the Vice President, Research and the Chief Economist at BDC. He's been the Chief Economist at BDC since 2012 and has previously worked in Quebec and internationally in both the private and the public sectors. And so Pierre will provide that national and global perspective that's so important. And following our 2 presentations, we will have time for question and answers. And you will be able to use the chat feature that you should see, the 3 little dots or the bubble on your screen that you can use to supply your questions. So let's get started here and talk about the overall economic impacts. So the headline here is, it's quite bad. What we are showing here is our preliminary estimates. They're intended to provide an early indication of the overall effect of the shutdown on Atlantic Canada's economy. And as we only have annual provincial GDP data, which is a measure of output, aggregate output in the economy, we've had to create our own monthly GDP series for Atlantic Canada using various Statistics Canada data sources. And then we've created some estimates for March and April, which are derived from a variety of sources, including confidential information that's been provided to APEC, as well as industry surveys and other economic intelligence. I do want to thank all our members and other stakeholders that have shared some of their confidential information with us. It's very helpful. So the headline number coming out of this is estimate in March that Atlantic Canada's GDP was down by about 10%. And that's in line with Statistics Canada's flash estimate for March, where the estimated nationally output was down about 9%. But March was only the beginning of the shutdown, and a lot of the shutdown only happened in the second half of the month. So we think we are going to see another double-digit decline in output in April. We think output this month is down about another 13%. So that leaves this quarter, April, May, and June, down over 20% from this time last year. So a very significant decline in overall output. And you see here just one potential recovery scenario, which assumes that some easing of fiscal distancing begins in June. And again, we might see some provinces recover. But I just want to emphasize, we just don't know how quickly some provinces will start to open up. And so this recovery could be a lot slower than we're currently assuming. But on this scenario, we are still looking at a double-digit decline in overall economic output in Atlantic Canada this year. And certainly that's larger than some of the banks and others are forecasting. But again, I think we want to be very cautious about how quickly we assume things are going to get back to normal. So which industries have been affected? Well, every industry has been affected by some degree or another, complying with COVID health requirements, some unable to operate or shut down, some facing a declining demand as consumers stay home, others struggling with supply chain issues or to maintain their workforce. But some industries have clearly been hit harder. If we look at the biggest ones that have been hit hard, the accommodation and food services, which is our restaurants and our hotels, are largely shut. Arts, entertainment, and recreation, the sporting, cultural, and recreation events have been cancelled because they have large audiences and gatherings. And these two industries account for about a combined 3% of Atlantic Canada's GDP, so a relatively small part of our economy, but they account for 9% of employment, so they're much bigger employment impact, and they have been hit very hard. The retail sector has also been hit very hard. Some of those have, some sectors in that have suffered declines in output of more than 50%, but the overall decline in retail is masked by increased spending at grocery stores as well as in online sales. Other industries that are infected fairly significantly include construction, with a pause in many major projects or future projects on hold, particularly Newfoundland and Labrador. Manufacturing, we've seen a number of food processors affected by the drop in demand due to restaurant closures here and elsewhere. The fishing and agriculture industry also impacted by lower demand from processors and ultimately from restaurants. And then wholesale and transportation again declined due to reductions in that retail and manufacturing output, as well as air transportation, which has been decimated by the shutdown. So I hope you also understand, as we look at this, the very interconnected nature of these effects, that spillovers from one sector impact another. And this has implications for the restart, because some businesses will not be able to fully ramp up until the end user is back in operation. So until we're flying again, until we're driving, the demand for refined petroleum and therefore the demand for oil will not come back. Until we're back in our restaurants, eating the meals we used to eat, the demand for the food processors and their demand for agriculture supplies and fishing supplies will not fully come back. So that's our estimate of what we think the output has been. And certainly there are other sectors that are being affected. The professional services are also going to be impacted by the slowdown. The law firms, the accountancy is the general slowdown in business activity. Housing markets, private healthcare, and other face-to-face services also seeing greatly reduced shutdowns. So these are our overall estimates. The only official data we have to date is from Statistics Canada's labour force survey, which provided data for March. And here we are seeing the biggest monthly decline on record, a loss of close to 50,000 jobs in Atlantic Canada. That's about 4% of total employment. And you see here some of the biggest sectors that saw those job losses or people not hired: accommodation and food services, the retail trade industry, the culture and recreation industry, and manufacturing being among some of the largest affected industries. And some groups, such as part-time workers, females, and youth, were particularly hard hit. But again, this data was collected as things were starting to shut down, so we would expect the April data to show even larger declines. But even here, the key statistic to watch is not so much the employment, which is down 4%, but hours worked, which fell 17% in that month, because some people are still technically employed by their employer, but they're either working no hours or greatly reduced hours. And most industries had declines of around 10% or more in hours worked. So we have been in the last 6 weeks estimating the impact on various sectors. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You can find the details on our COVID web pages where we have analysis for all of these sectors. But let me just emphasize some key points. The losses are large. We estimate our restaurants are losing up to $1 billion in sales this quarter. They're growing every week. Weekly retail sales average around $750 million. So every week we remain in shutdown, the losses are growing. And then as we approach summer, the losses will increase even faster. For example, in employment in the accommodation services, that's our hotels and similar type accommodations, employment in August is 70% higher than it is in April. So the longer this goes into the summer months, these losses will increase. So what is the fiscal cost of these estimates, of these economic losses and the shutdown? Well, again, the headline here is, it's bad. The current federal deficit was initially estimated to be about $28 billion this fiscal year. With a decline in real GDP and spending measures totaling over $120 billion to date in direct funding, we estimate this will push the overall deficit to $200 billion. And that's only including measures up to the last few days. So this deficit will grow if those income supports are needed for longer than currently assumed. And again, we're not capturing any bailouts or support for other levels of government. When we look at provincial finances, we see a similar situation. It's bad. Last time in the webinar, we showed you the relative decline in the last recession, and you see that in the blue and the orange bars. The green bars show the existing fiscal balance for each province as a share of GDP, and now we've shown some partial estimates in red for the post-COVID-19 situation. So again, what this really captures is the decline in all source revenues from the decline in the economy and some of the announcements on COVID-19 spending measures. It is certainly not a full estimate of the actual impact on our provincial finances. There's lots of spending decisions that the provinces will be privy to. We've not tried to estimate all those details. This is really the own source revenues and the direct COVID spending measures. But typically when the economy declines, social assistance spending goes up. There's other accommodating adjustments we see. And so RBC Economics put out their estimates yesterday. And so you could easily add another percentage point to the deficit for the maritime provinces. And Newfoundland and Labrador is being particularly hard hit by the decline in oil prices, pushing their deficit beyond 5% of GDP. And RBC estimates that could go as high as 7% of GDP. And it's not just the federal government and the provinces. Municipalities are also being affected. In Atlantic Canada, property taxes account for about 80% of the revenues in our 6 largest cities. Some of those property tax revenues have been deferred. There's been a loss of transit and parking and other revenues. And so we're already starting to see the first round of layoffs in Halifax, for example, with 1,500 jobs cut. So we're already starting to see adjustments taking place in our municipalities. So when will the shutdown end? Are we seeing any signs that this is coming to an end? Well, you can go to our website, and on our website, you will see up-to-date charts and tables tracking what's happening with COVID cases, as well as our broader economic analysis. And encourage you to visit our website. You can follow us for our more frequent updates on social media or sign up for email updates. But you'll see more up-to-date charts and tables as we track what's happening both provincially and internationally. So let me just give you a quick snapshot of where we are today. And this is quite a shift in this table from when we first started tracking. 6 weeks ago, the trend in new cases, new weekly cases, was all going up. We are now starting to see some provinces with a slowdown in the number of new cases. And in New Brunswick and PEI in particular, we've not had any new cases of COVID, reported cases of COVID in the last week. Newfoundland and Labrador reporting only one. So we are starting to see the initial surge come to an end in some of our provinces, but others are still seeing an increase in the number of cases each week. And I highlight this because this is really critical for our interprovincial exports. Interprovincial trade in Atlantic Canada accounts for about 60% of our GDP. And when you look at our exports to other provinces, Central Canada, Ontario, and Quebec, where we've seen the largest number of cases, where we've seen the highest intensity of reported cases per population, these account for over 50% of Atlantic Canada's interprovincial exports. So the recovery, the size of the downturn, and the start of the recovery in those two provinces is really critical for a number of businesses providing goods and services in Atlantic Canada. Western Canada has also been hit fairly hard, but those only account for about 16% of our exports. And what happens in the rest of Atlantic Canada, including in Nova Scotia, that trade accounts for about 1/3 of our interprovincial exports. So it's still important that we monitor what's happening not just in our own jurisdictions, but what's happening in neighboring provinces. Internationally, we have the same situation. International trade accounts for about 3/4 of our GDP. And so the drop in demand through a decline in air travel, the drop in demand in markets that have also seen closures and losses of income is all going to be part of this transmission mechanism. And the IMF forecasts that global GDP is going to decline by about 3% this year. And this table shows our top 10 trading partners. The US is still our biggest export market. Over 70% of our exports go there. And the number of weekly cases in the United States is still rising. China is our second largest export market, accounting for over 55% of our exports, including fish and lobster. And then the European Union accounts for about 14% of our exports. And you see a number of countries in Europe that were very high intensity number of cases relative to their population. And that's no surprise, therefore, that the IMF forecasts that some of these countries will see a much steeper drop in their economies this year. And even China, though you see it's the only one showing positive growth, that is still a substantial slowdown from the normal 6 to 7% of GDP. So let's talk a bit about policy and recovery. Governments have rightly focused on a number of key priorities, and containment is still the most important economic policy because it determines the duration and severity of the Great Shutdown. Focusing on supply chain for key items is also critical to ensure that households have food on their tables and businesses, the healthcare system have the supplies they need, and other businesses have the critical inputs. And this still needs careful monitoring. And a key economic development strategy here has been to help retool or reconfigure some businesses in Canada and this region to help meet some of these critical supply chain needs where we're struggling to get some of those supplies from our international partners. Cash flow for businesses struggling to meet rent and other commitments has also been important. The wage subsidy for businesses opened for applications yesterday. And let me just emphasize 3 points on this. That businesses can access the same degree of support. So whether you meet the minimum 30% drop in income For the wage subsidy, whether you've seen a 70% drop, you can access the same degree of support. But these supports are time limited. Some businesses may be out of action for much longer than others. And the supports are also based on the immediate income loss in the months of March, April, and May. Some organizations are going to face a loss later in the year. For example, APEC has not seen any major reductions in income at this point. We have lost a couple of our offshore oil and gas members from Newfoundland and Labrador, and that's no surprise given what's happened to oil prices. But our losses will come in June when we're not able to hold our major projects event, and in the fall as we start to see provinces roll out their plans for getting back. Our fall events are now at risk, so our income losses will come later in the year. So it's not a narrow 3-month window that we are looking at, it's an annual loss of income due to COVID, and many other organizations will be in the same situation. Income support for households, the $2,000 per month Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, seems reasonably well targeted for a single person low-income household based upon our analysis of essential spending needs, and we'll have more details on that in the coming week. But longer term, we also need to remember that the various supports that are being provided, which are essential to help bridge the gap that both businesses and individuals face, are adding to our debt. They are adding, as I showed on that federal slide, to our deficit. We're adding to our debt, and we estimate that will add currently about $2 billion to our annual federal debt service charges. So that will push up tax rates in the years to come to pay for those increased debt and the debt service payments. And then as we think about recovery, starting to help businesses get back to operation while meeting those health restrictions that will still be in place, as we saw, for example, with the package for seafood industry this past weekend. But I just want to caution governments to be very careful as they think about stimulating the economy. We really don't know how long and what nature the recovery will be. This is a Bank of Canada estimate showing a couple of different scenarios just to illustrate the range from a small, fairly shallow and recession with a fairly quick recovery, and a much larger impact with a much slower recovery that takes into 2022 before we start to see that type of recovery. And again, depending upon how many businesses fail to make it through the loss of income that individuals suffer in some of those industries, that might lead to a much longer scenario. So let's just look back at what happened with international air travel after 9/11, and then also with the impact of SARS and the Great Recession. So this chart is showing international air travel into Canada, and the blue lines here show international people flying into Canada. And you see this huge drop in 9/11, you see a further drop with SARS, and again in the recession. So it took about 3 years to recover from 9/11 in terms of international air visits to Canada. SARS, there was about a 15-month recovery, but after the Great Recession in 08-09, it took about 6 years. And you see, even on this line, the international air travel to Canada did not really exceed its pre-9/11 levels until 2014, 2015, close to 15 years after that initial impact. By contrast, Canadian air travel, which is shown in the red line here, so this is Canadians traveling overseas, coming back by air. Again, we saw 2.5 years to recover from 9/11, 9 months to recover from SARS, and about 2 years to recover from the recession. So it will take different lengths of time for different markets to recover, and that has implications for the length of that recovery. This is important for our tourism industry. The number of room night sales in Atlantic Canada peak, as you would expect, in July and August. So the longer this goes on, the longer the cumulative losses. By the end of this month, we would estimate that they've lost around 10% of their room night sales due to shutdowns due to COVID. But by the end of August, if they're not able to reopen, those annual sales will amount to over half of their typical annual room nights sold. So that's a critical impact that shows the duration that does have direct impacts on the total losses. But we also need to think about the origin of these people coming to stay in our region. And I'm using here data for New Brunswick specifically. So the international market, the US and international, typically accounts for less than 10% of room sales in New Brunswick. But if we're not likely to get our interprovincial people coming from other parts of Canada, those losses start to creep up to 40%. And if we don't get people traveling within the Atlantic region this summer, again, those losses increase. So New Brunswick accommodation industry may only be relying on those people who can travel and stay within their province. And again, that's assuming they feel comfortable. Some who might typically go elsewhere might choose to stay in New Brunswick. So again, there's fairly significant sectoral and geographic impacts on these particular markets. So which industries are going to get back sooner? This is a chart just illustrating some of the lower risk activities that we think are the higher risk activities, which will be later in the process. And we've already started to see Saskatchewan and New Brunswick start to outline how they are going to reopen. So for businesses that are able to operate without physical distancing restrictions, continue working or start to resume those operations, they will be sooner. Other industries will have to look at modified operations, whether it's a retail outlet, a restaurant, or manufacturing. They have to be able to comply with some modified measures to, again, on physical distancing. But others that cannot get back to face-to-face activity or full activity at our bars, our restaurants, will be later when we feel that it is safe to resume some of these normal activities. Similarly, as I estimated for trade and travel, intraprovincial within our province will start sooner. Interprovincial borders will be much later in the process, and international activity is likely to be even later. And so again, as you look at different size of groups, different densities, different proximity, you'll start to see a phased opening of the economy. So what might the recovery look like? Well, this is a chart that doesn't have any fixed scale and it doesn't have a fixed timeline because I'm trying to illustrate the concepts. We're currently in this phase where we're seeing the initial slump. And the longer it goes on, we are likely to see more businesses slowing down and shutting down as those economic impacts and losses accumulate. But this is where we start to see an opening up. And again, the recovery is going to vary by sector for the reasons I've outlined. But we will expect to see some natural release of pent-up demand, appointments that have been missed, shopping that has been put on hold, home renovation projects that have been put on hold, just going out to a restaurant to celebrate meeting together. We will start to see a natural recovery. And this is where we want to be really careful we don't overstimulate the economy. Some sectors will not come back as fast. But again, we want to be very careful we don't put undue pressure on an economy that's recovering in this phase. Otherwise, we're just going to fuel inflation. Where we want to focus on are the sectors that are not going to come back as quickly, that might need longer support, and where those more permanent measures and declines in activity may be. So that's a quick snapshot of what's happening in Atlantic Canada. And now I'm going to hand over to Pierre to talk about what's happening in our international markets.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. My presentation has two parts. I'm going to first talk about a little bit about the world, the US and Canada, the situation right now. And second, I'm going to talk about two possible scenario for the recovery. So if we start with the world, as David said, well, the world economy is in recession right now. The forecast is going to be a drop for 2020, about 2 or 3%. This is obviously the largest decline since the last recession. And this recession at the world level is having different impact. The first impact is on the stock market. As you know, the stock market really dropped since the beginning of the crisis. We are seeing that the stock market is coming back slowly. Some economies are reopening and some businesses are reopening. We can see that the stock market is increasing, but we believe it's going to take some time before we go back to the level of the pre-crisis. Another impact, which is very important for Canada, is on the oil price. Actually, every recession has an impact on commodity prices. What the most important commodity for Canada is oil, and as you can see from the graph, there's actually two shocks on the oil price. The first one is related to the virus, and if you look at the blue line, which is the world price, the WTI, the world price started to decline at the beginning of the virus. So when the virus hit China, we started to see a decline. And the reason for that is because the market was afraid that the demand would slow down, and it did happen. The world demand right now is about 70 billion barrel a day, which is much lower than the 100 million barrel a day that we had before the crisis. So the demand dropped by 30%. That's the reason why the price is really declining. But there's a second shock that started at the end of March when we had the price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. And that really, as you can see from the graph, had an impact, a negative impact on the price. While there was an agreement a week ago between the APEC countries, including Saudi Arabia and Russia, well, that didn't really help the price because the demand, the world demand has been slowing down so much. So not only the price is low, but we expect the price to stay low for a while. As the economy are going to reopen, the demand for oil is going to increase. However, because there's so much oil around the world, it's going to take some time to absorb this oversupply. And that's the reason why we believe that although the oil price is going to come back slowly as the economy is going to reopen, it's going to take probably years before we go back to the level of the pre-crisis. So this is going to have an impact, of course, on different parts of the country, especially for Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, but also for the overall Canadian economy, because as you may know, 20% of everything we export is related to oil. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about the U.S. The reason why I focus a bit about the U.S. is, as you know, it's our #1 trade partner. 75% of Canadian export are going to the U.S. So this is a very important country for us. And as for Canada, the news are quite negative. The U.S. economy is in recession. And if you look on the right side of the slide, you can see our expectation per quarter. So you see a very important drop for the quarter. For the second quarter, we expect the economy to drop by more than 30%. We believe that the economy is going to improve. The recovery is going to start on the third quarter, and it's going to accelerate by the end of the year. Nevertheless, for the overall 2020, where our forecast is that the GDP is going to have negative growth of -4%. It's going to take months before we go to a full recovery. We believe 2021 is going to be a year of growth. We expect to go back to the pre-crisis level probably in mid-2021 if everything goes well. So it's going to take probably more than a year to go back to the pre-recession level. So as you can expect, many sectors of the economy in the U.S. has been really affected. And here you can see the impact on the manufacturing sector, the manufacturing index activity. It shows that this is really early numbers, but this is the most recent number. As you can see, the decline is very important. The impact is not only severe for businesses, it's also very severe on people. And more than 20 million Americans lost their job and they claimed for unemployment insurance. So this is really unprecedented. We never saw that before. Even in the last recession, 2008, 2009, the level of people who claimed unemployment insurance was much lower. It was a different recession, of course. So many of these Americans are going to go back to work when the economy reopened. But nevertheless, the shock, as you can see here, is very severe on the U.S. economy. So to respond to this shock, the Federal Reserve have reduced interest rate to almost zero. And the idea is to help the economy to recovery. Also, the U.S. government has introduced different programs to help Americans and also businesses. Programs it's represent more than $2 trillion, or about 10% of the U.S. economy. So that's very, very significant. You can see more than $500 billion for the aerospace industry, more than $500 billion in direct transfer to Americans, to individuals, a lot of money also for small business and for different sectors of the economy. So the idea of these programs is to help people and to help businesses through this very difficult time, but it's also going to help the recovery, because when you inject money in the economy, this is stimulate the economy at the same time. So if we go to the Canadian story, well, the Canadian story is it's a bit similar, but the numbers are even worse. And the reason for that is the shock of the oil sector. The U.S. is also producing oil, but the oil sector is relatively bigger in Canada than in the U.S. So the impact of this crisis is actually worse in Canada than it is in the United States. So again, if you look on the right side of the slide, you can see our forecast. Again, similar trend than in the U.S., but the numbers are a little bit worse. The shock is really severe in the second quarter of the year. We believe the economy is going to reopen in the third quarter, probably at the end of the second quarter. So the economy is going to start a recovery this summer during the third quarter of the year, and it's going to accelerate by the end of the year. Having said that, overall for 2020, our forecast is the Canadian economy will remain in recession and will have negative growth of almost 6% for the year. Just like in the US, we believe the recovery is going to happen in 2021. Probably mid-2021, we should probably reach the pre-crisis level. But it's going to take, as you can see, more than a year to do that. The impact on different sectors of the economy is strong, but it's really a huge impact on small business. For the last, since the beginning of the crisis, we surveyed more than 1,000 small and mid-sized firms across the country to understand what is the impact of this crisis on them. Our latest result shows that 90%, which is really a huge number, 90% of small businesses in Canada are negatively affected by this crisis. And the main reason is the lack of demand. At the beginning, we thought that supply would be a problem, but actually it's not really the issue. The issue is the fact that many businesses across the country are closed, or if they're not closed, the demand they are facing is much lower than before. So this is really a huge impact on businesses. And the impact is also very important on people. Just like in the US, the number, actually 1 million Canadians lost their jobs since the beginning of the crisis. Our unemployment rate has increased to 7.8%. This is for March, so this is just the beginning of the crisis. The numbers for April will probably look even worse. So the unemployment rate now is 7.8% in Canada. And as a result, just like in the US, our central bank, the Bank of Canada, has reduced interest rate to almost zero. And the federal government has introduced a number of programs that are not, if we go to the next slide, a number of programs directly for Canadians, to help Canadians to go through this period of time. I'm not going to give you too much detail. You can have much more detail on the BDC website or at the federal government website. Maybe the most important or interesting program is the wage subsidy program that started yesterday. So businesses can obtain up to 75% in wage subsidy if they have kept their employees or if they hire their employee for the next 30 days. And it's also if the subsidy apply for the entire month of April and up to 2 weeks in March. So this is a very important program to help businesses to keep their employees. But the amount of programs in Canada is very significant. I'm going to come back to that. So this is having an impact on the Canadian dollar. The dollar is at 71 cents right now. It's a drop compared to the pre-crisis. We were around 75 cents. The most important reason for that is the strong correlation between our dollar and the oil price. As the oil price went down, our dollar went down as well. So we believe that the dollar is going to remain low, around 70 cents probably for the next 6 months, as the oil price is going to take some time to go back up. So we believe that our dollar is going to remain quite low. So the last part of the presentation is about the recovery. David talked about it and explained it very well. I'll just give you our perspective on two different scenarios. Some economists believe it's going to be a short-term shock. The shock is going to be very severe, but the initial recovery should be quite quick. The second scenario is we will have a long-term recession that it is going to take many years before we go back to normal. We believe our number one scenario, or our base scenario, is the number one scenario. We believe that after this very severe shock, when the Canadian economy is going to reopen, the initial recovery is going to be quite quick. Some sectors will take more time to recover fully, but we believe that by the mid-2021, the Canadian economy should be back at the level of the pre-crisis. And there's two reasons why we believe this scenario is our favorite scenario. The first one is we look, and I'm going to explain it a little bit later, we look at what happened in other countries who have been going through this crisis before us. And the best country is China, although China is different. It's a different economy than the Canadian economy. China was the first country hit by the virus. It was also the first country to end the lockdown. So the initial shock was very important in China, just like what we are seeing in Canada. For example, the retail sales dropped by 20%, industrial output dropped by 13%, the unemployment rate increased significantly. But what is interesting, when at the end of the lockdown, we can see that the economy came back in some sector very quickly. So for example, if you look at the manufacturing index, which you see on the slide in black here, it's actually back to normal after a month of the end of the lockdown. So manufacturing, construction sectors, these two sectors came back really quickly, which is not the case for sectors related to consumer. As you can see from the graph, the service sector takes a bit more time to recovery. And the reason is consumer seems to be more cautious after the crisis. If we go to the next slide, we can see that consumer are back, people are back to work, but they're not back shopping. So they're still reluctant to take the subway. The percentage of use of subway is still low, and people are cautious. They are health cautious about taking public transportation, and that is going to take more time for retail and services to go back to normal. So what we are seeing in other countries who have been going through this, some sectors are coming back very quickly. That's the case of manufacturing, constructions, and some sectors are going to take more time. Is the case of sectors related to consumption. And obviously, like David explained it before, tourism is going to take a bit more time. So that's the first reason why we believe that the initial recovery is going to be quite quick. That's learning from experience from other countries. The second reason is the amount of money spent by the government to help Canadians and Canadian businesses is going to make a difference in this recovery. Right now, the table shows more than $200 billion in spending for the Canadian government, but over the last week, there was additional programs. We are over $300 billion, which represent about 15% of the Canadian economy. So this is going to help for a faster recovery. To give you an example, the Canadian government spent about $50 billion during the last recession to ease the recession on Canadian. Well, this number is much bigger now. It represents about 15% of the GDP right now. So this is the second reason why we believe that the recovery is going to be, the initial recovery anyway, is going to be quite quick. And like I said, some sectors are going to take a bit more time. So, and I'm going to conclude on the next two slides. Some people ask me when I give this presentation before, can we afford all these programs that we are seeing at the Canadian level? The answer is yes. The graph that you see now is our debt to GDP ratio for the G7 countries, the most industrial country in the world. And as you can see, Canada has the lowest debt to GDP ratio. We are in a very good position. We were in a very good position before this crisis. So that allows the Canadian government to really spend money to help Canadian businesses and help the recovery. So we are in a very good position. So in conclusion, we believe that after this initial shock that we are seeing in the second quarter of the year, we're going to see the recovery to start in the third quarter, and the economy should accelerate by the end of the year. Again, the Canadian economy is going to remain in recession this year, but we believe that the recovery is going to happen in 2021, and by mid-2021, we should be back to the pre-crisis situation. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre, for that. We do have some time for questions. I know we've already got some questions coming in, so if you just want to use the chat feature to do that, we will try to cover as many questions we can in the time remaining. Just a couple of quick questions I saw earlier I'll just respond to. One about the underground economy. We don't know how big that is. Could it increase as tax rates come up in the recovery? Certainly that's a possibility. It's just really hard to get a handle on that. Gasoline sales, yes, are down. Prices have dropped, and typically a drop in prices would stimulate demand, but because people are not driving, because they're not going to work, the volume of sales will also be down. We don't have any specific numbers on that at the moment. Other services, there was a question about what's in other services. That's your haircuts, that's your car repairs. So again, some of those activities have been shut down because of these things. So the key question that I'm seeing coming in from several of you is around, are we expecting a second or third wave? And I think I just want to emphasize this, and then I'll let Pierre give his views. You know, in our current scenario that you saw in our chart, no, we're not anticipating a second wave. We've not built that in. But I would emphasize, as I mentioned on the risk chart, we really don't want to see second and third waves of this. If we see things being relaxed and then we see them being tightened, that's going to be really bad for the business community. So I think governments really need to be cautious in how quickly they reopen, because we can't rule out a possibility of a second or third wave. So Pierre, I don't know if you want to jump in on that particular question. There's lots of questions about second or third waves, and also a specific question in terms of some people looking in at recovery in the fourth quarter of 38%. I think that number stands out. Maybe you can just put that in context as you talk about potential second or third waves.
Okay, just quickly on the second wave, there's definitely a risk for that, and that's why governments are going to be very cautious about how they reopen the economy. The good news is when we look at the countries in Europe who have started to reopen the economy about 3 weeks ago, we're talking about Denmark, Australia, Germany, what we are seeing is the number of cases is still going down. So even if these economies have been reopening and they have been, like, for example, kids are going to school, some of the sectors, even the retail sector, have been reopened, it doesn't seem to have a negative impact on the number of cases. So we will hope that is going to be the case in Canada. The 38% is because it's compared to the quarter before. So that's why this number looks so big. If the second quarter will lose 30% of the economy, if the economy is going down by 30%, well, when the next quarter, when the economy is increasing, you're going to see, you can see a big number. So that's the reason that the 38% is because it's compared to the quarter before, which was really low because of the shock of the crisis.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. And again, just to respond to some comments there, you know, our scenarios don't have second or third waves in, just because we don't know the timing and how severe they are. We're just flagging at the moment the risks and how serious that could be. And again, that's why it's so important. The initial containment measures and how carefully we reopen are going to be critical. I'm seeing some questions here, Pierre, around kind of longer term implications of this. One, for example, on are we going to see a shift away from global value chains and supply chains to more local supply chains? We're already seeing a bit of that in the crisis. How is that going to impact the economy? And given that so much of North America is driven by the consumer, again, is that going to have some impacts in terms of the economy and the huge unemployment numbers that you showed and the impact of that on spending? So again, are we going to see some longer term impacts through consumer spending and some of these structural shifts that we might see in global supply chains? Pierre, do you have any views on those, how those might impact the long term recovery?
Yes, I think we are studying consumer trends to see how consumers are changing right now and how this is going to have an impact at the end of the crisis. The biggest impact that we see is people are buying much more online. The online business has been increasing by more than 100% since the beginning of the crisis. So this is very significant. Of course, when stores are going to be reopened, some of the online business is going to be lost. But we believe that the crisis is going to change the behavior of some consumer. So the biggest change we see that the online business after this crisis is going to be more significant than before. A second trend is so far Canadian consumers has been more cautious than before the crisis. They spend much more on essential products than before. That's also what we see in other countries that have been going through this before us. So it's going to take some time before consumers feel confident enough to spend as much as before. So it's going to be a slow process. In terms of local, we tested this idea with a survey with consumer, and it doesn't seem to be, although we talk about it in the media and everything, consumer doesn't seem to be very keen on this idea. They are really looking at price to have good deals because they have been suffering in terms of revenue. So I'm not sure if this crisis will have a big impact on local products.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. A couple of questions have come in just around kind of international movement. So again, as I mentioned, I think the international travel component is going to come back much more slowly than we'd expect, even the interprovincial. And yes, that will have some impact, not just on direct demand in international trading partners, but our ability to manage clients in those markets when we can't travel. So certainly different segments of the economy will come back slow. And that was a key message I was trying to emphasize. Interprovincial markets will not come back as fast as our own province, and our international markets are also going to be impacted by that lack of travel, and that will also impact international movement of workers. We've seen some accommodation to try and help ensure that there's temporary foreign workers for some of our industries like the seafood industry. But we typically see a lot of temporary foreign workers coming in to help service different projects, and immigration has been a key source driving both population and labor force trends and spending in Atlantic Canada in the last few years. So it's not clear how quickly governments will start to reopen some of those channels. But again, I think we're going to see what's critical is not just what happens to COVID in our jurisdictions, it's how quickly it's eliminated in other jurisdictions, and that will really drive how quickly we can reopen some of those international borders. A couple of other questions, Pierre, that have come up. One is around kind of long-term debt cycles and just concerns as we are adding to the debt, not just here in Canada, but around the world, how that might impact the recovery, and also whether there's going to be other kind of structural changes, people talking about how automation and other things that are being impacted in terms of digital health and advanced manufacturing. Now, are we going to see everything come back to normal? How might the economy change kind of structurally as a result of what we're seeing with this current pandemic? Do you have any thoughts on either the debt components or kind of more structural changes in the economy? Any thoughts?
I think the debt is going to have an impact. Before the crisis, the consumer debt ratio in Canada was high. and I think it's going to be even worse after the crisis. So I think it's going to take more time for consumer to go back to normal. What we learned from the previous recession in 2009 is in countries like in the US, where consumers were really in debt before the crisis, it took a long time before consumer confidence was back. So I think it's going to be the case this time in Canada. And on the business side, also, in the survey we're doing, when we ask Canadian SMEs, small business, what is the crisis going to change after this? Well, it's two elements that people are saying that we're going to be more cautious about investing. We want to have a more secure business because we learned from this crisis that you never know when something will happen. And secondly, they want to invest much more in online business. So I think the debt issue is going to stick with us for a while.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. I'm seeing a couple of other questions, again, just around the recovery and just concerns around that we are not going to be fully through this until we have a vaccine, and there's different estimates of how long it might take to have either vaccines or treatments for this. So again, the questions are really around assumptions of the recovery and to what extent things can renormalize by, kind of the summer of 2021 if we don't have a vaccine, and therefore if number of businesses or consumers are still dealing with various types of restrictions, and therefore some of these longer term impacts on incomes and spending that then drives spending for our food processors and our fishery industry. So any thoughts around, like, is your scenario dependent upon having a vaccine? Do you see the economy being able to return even without complete elimination of the various restrictions?
I think the economy is going to go back to almost normal by mid-2021, except for some sectors. And David, you made a very good explanation about the tourist sector. I totally agree. Traveling tourism is going to be the sector that is going to take the more time to recovery, and the vaccine is going to have a huge impact on this sector. For other sectors of the economy, more the local sector, I think we're going to have a full recovery by mid-2021.
And a couple of other questions. I'll just jump in on one quickly, and then I'll throw the other to you, Pierre. Again, concerns around food chains. Yes, I think, as I flagged in my chart, those supply chains, especially around food, are critical that we maintain those. I know, as my wife, as a designated shopper, is telling me that there's lots of prices that are jumping up in our grocery stores, and supplies are not there as they were. So again, I don't have any official Statistics Canada data to verify what she's telling me, but we are certainly seeing some impacts in our grocery stores. So again, if you think about how this has impacted society, if we start to see any real pressures on our food supply, that could quickly intensify those concerns. So again, that's critical that we do what we can to maintain that. The other question has come up is around kind of government supports. And I don't know, Pierre, since you've been surveying some of your smaller businesses in Canada, and the question is, are there sufficient supports to help businesses through this at this time? Because if they're not able to stay afloat, they are not going to be there in the recovery to reopen. So do you have any thoughts about, is the government providing enough support at this time? Do you see any areas where that might need to be expanded as governments still respond on this?
I think so far, I think there's a number of programs that is, the goal is really to cover every sector of the economy. It probably doesn't, but I think the government has done a good job to really help a lot of businesses. Obviously, despite this help, some businesses are not going to go through this crisis because it's such an important crisis for many businesses. So it's going to be tough for some businesses. I also believe that after this initial shock and these initial programs that has been announced so far, I think there's going to be more program for the recovery. When the economy is reopened and the economy is ready to the full recovery, I think governments are going to introduce other programs to help specific sectors to accelerate the recovery as well.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre. We are basically at time. I know there's been some other questions we have not had time to fully cover. I've been trying to find thematic questions that have had the greatest interest. If there are specific questions we see in the chat we might be able to comment on, we will try to see if there's ways that we can respond to those. But I do want to thank Pierre Cléroux for joining me today to share his kind of global thoughts and national thoughts about what's happening. As I mentioned, that's so important. Again, we will be sending you a brief survey. I'd encourage you to complete that before. It should only take a minute. You should get an email about that. Our next webinar will be coming up on May the 20th. Watch out for details in the next week or so. Again, you can find more details on our COVID web pages, and you can learn more about APEC and what we do. So thank you all for joining us today. Special thanks to Pierre Cléroux for joining me. And again, the recording and the slides will be available later today for the slides and tomorrow for the full recording if you want to go back. So thank you all for attending. And this concludes our webinar this morning. Thank you very much.